who provides bread. But he knows that's not the only thing God does. And so even when you're going through times where there's no bread, you still live by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And so Jesus overcomes this temptation. And just for now, I think this is what's important to take note of. This is a real temptation, similar to ones that you and I face. We face temptations like this too. We're going through weak times. We begin to doubt. But whereas you and I, we often fail. We fall into those temptations. Here in this case, it's very clear. Jesus does not sin. He does not fall for this temptation. All right, I want to look at the second temptation. It's almost like a polar opposite temptation. So if in the first temptation, the devil hits him in a weak spot, I would say in the second temptation, the devil hits him at his strength. So verse 5 says, "Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. 'If you are the Son of God,' he said," using this tool of doubt again, he says, "throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." What's going on here? Like I said, at first, the first temptation, he hits him at a weak spot. I would say in this temptation, he hits him at one of his strengths. So Jesus has just said, okay, I'm going to live by faith. In fact, he uses these words that he's going to live on every word that comes from the mouth of God. And you want to know what the devil says to him? He says, okay, you want to live on every word that comes from the mouth of God? And now this is surprising. I don't know if you knew this, but the devil knows Scripture. He quotes Scripture. In fact, he quotes from Psalm 91. He says, "He will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." And this is a Scripture passage, Psalm 91, if you've read it, which, by the way, promises that God protects his people. And the devil, in essence, comes to Jesus and says this, all right, you're good at faith. You want to live on every word that comes from the mouth of God? Okay, prove it. Take a leap of faith. I mean, literally. Throw yourself off this temple and live by the faith that you're proclaiming. See if the angels won't come and scoop you up. I mean, this is a real kind of temptation, by the way. It's one that you and I face all the time. The devil often takes our strengths and tries to twist them. So, as an example, let's say that you're a self-confident kind of person. That's a good thing. You have a good, positive self-image. You want to know what happens? That can get twisted just a little bit into pride or into vanity. I mean, it's a strength, but we can be tempted there. Or let's just say that you're a person who God has given the tremendous ability to make riches and wealth. With just a little twist, that can turn into greed or materialism. Or let's say, as an example, God's given you a love for truth. You're a person who just loves truth and wants to live by truth. That's your strength. You want to know what can happen without very much effort at all? You can become a person who's quarrelsome with others and impatient with people who don't live by the truth. See how that works? Whatever our strengths are, the devil can also take those and just twist them. And Jesus has just said, I want to live by faith. I want to live on every word that comes from the mouth of God. And Satan, in effect, oh yeah? Then do it. And it's interesting how Jesus responds. Again, and I'd have you take note of this, he responds with a quotation from Scripture. He answers in verse 7, he says, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." And I think it's important to take note of what happens here in this interchange between Jesus and the tempter. So the tempter comes and says, okay, here's a Scripture passage. Do you believe it? Then live by it. And Jesus interprets Scripture with Scripture, which is something we should always do. We should never just rip something in isolation and just, okay, what does this mean by itself? But in the broad picture of Scripture, what does it mean? And he gives insight into this. He interprets Scripture with Scripture. Don't put the Lord your God to the test. And if I was to kind of summarize what it is that Jesus does here, I would put it this way. So suppose that you were headed out on a trip. And it was a family trip. You were going to go on vacation somewhere. It was going to be several days of driving. I think it's great. It's appropriate that maybe you'd pause, you'd lead your family in prayer, and you'd say, Lord, keep us safe. We want to claim the promises of Psalm 91, and we know that you are going to guard our ways. I think that would be a good, appropriate prayer. Right? Psalm 91 says that God protects his people. That would be putting your faith in God, understanding this passage of Scripture. It would be another thing if, for example, you said, wow, Psalm 91, God is going to guard my life. You went out into the parking lot after the service, you got into your car, you went up to St. Lucie Boulevard, and you peeled out and went 90 miles an hour down St. Lucie West Boulevard without stopping at any red light. And as your family was holding on and screaming at you to stop, you said, hey, don't worry about it, Psalm 91. You get it? There's a difference, right? One is putting your faith in God. God, guard us on our ways. And one is being presumptuous of God, putting God to the test. And Jesus recognizes this for what it is. To throw himself off the temple would be very much like gunning at 90 miles an hour, putting God to the test. And so again here, just to keep note where we're at here, a real temptation, just like the ones you and I face. But whereas we often fail, Jesus succeeds. All right, third temptation. It begins in verse 8. So the first one, I think, hits at a weak spot. The second one at a strong spot. I would characterize the third one kind of hitting right down the middle. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Why do I say this is right down the middle? I would say that this strikes at the heart of Jesus' purpose. Jesus' purpose was to love the world. His purpose was to come and put the world back together again. He has a passion. Remember John 3:16? For God so loved the world that he sent his son. Jesus' purpose in life is to win the entire world to himself. And this is a case of means and ends. So here, at this moment, the devil makes an offer to him. He shows him all the world, and he says, I'll give you this. I will give you this. You will be successful. You will achieve your purpose if, in one brief moment, you'll just bow down and worship me right now. And again, I say this is a case of means and ends. Because if you finish out the gospel story, you realize that all the kingdoms of the world had been promised to Jesus anyhow. He was going to inherit all of them. The only problem was that there was a road of suffering and ultimately the cross that stood in his way. I mean, it would be tremendously painful, the route that he would have to take. And he can forego all that right now if he just, in one bow of the knee, worships the devil. He can have success now. You see that? And again, I think this is a temptation that we face all the time. All of us here have a different purpose, a different reason why God put us on the earth. And if we went around the room and asked everyone, what would it look like if your life was successful? Everyone would have a different answer, right? But whatever that thing is, where you said, okay, now I'm successful, I would say that's right at the heart of who you are, and we face temptations there all the time. I mean, just, you can imagine for a second, suppose that there's a person who is working in an industry. I mean, pretty vague, right? So everyone can kind of fill in the blanks. A person is working in an industry, and they want to be successful. And now they've just heard that a vice presidency of the company has opened up. And they say to themselves, that's where I need to be. And over the course of time, it may even be God's purpose in the long run that you would one day be the vice president of that company. You know that probably there's someone, one of your coworkers, who right now is more qualified than you. But there's this temptation. You think to yourself, you know, I could make up a lie about that person and throw them under the bus, and I would be right in line for that job. And you may even rationalize all the good that's going to come out of this, right? Like, I'll have more time with my family. That's a good thing. I'll have more money. I'll be able to give to my friends and family. I'll be able to give to the church. I'll be able to advance God's purposes. Being successful is what I ought to be. This is my purpose in life.